Welcome to Humanities Profile. My name is E. Ethelbert Miller, and my guest today is Dr. Ira Berlin. Dr. Berlin is a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland. He's the author of Slaves Without Masters and also Many Thousand Gone, the first 2 centuries of slavery in North America. Thank you for welcoming us into your home.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here.
We're doing a special initiative, We the People, that the NEH has funded. And what we hope to do this afternoon is discuss the Emancipation Proclamation. But before we do that, I'd like you to perhaps give us an overview of what the 1850s looked like in America, the decade before the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, the 1850s are certainly a very tumultuous decade in American history. Of course, they're a harbinger of even a more tumultuous decade, the 1860s. And when I think about the 1850s, I guess when I think about history generally, I always begin by talking about the majority of the people who are working. There are 2 major labor systems in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. They're extraordinarily different. They're confronting each other, and they, of course, are resting upon them are 2 very different societies. One is a society based upon slave labor, located in the southern part of the United States, but a system of slave labor which once had been a continental system, a system of slave labor, which is now almost 300 years old by the middle of the 19th century. There are 4 million people of African descent who are held as slaves, and they're supporting a plantation system, a system which is growing exportable crops, most importantly cotton, but also sugar, tobacco, rice, which is bringing an enormous amount of capital into the United States and making some people very, very rich. We tend to think of this system of slavery through the lens of its destruction. So we think about slavery as cotton. We think about slavery as the Black Belt, the Deep South. We think about slavery as the African Christian Church. But of course, that all is relatively new. That's been constructed pretty much in the 19th century. So slavery is a system which is old, it's changed, but it's also undergoing an enormous amount of change. And of course, probably the most important change that it's undergoing is its movement from the Atlantic coast to the interior of the South. And during the 19th century, most of those slaves have been transported from Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina to Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and of course across the Mississippi to Arkansas and Texas. 1 million slaves have been moved. It's been enormously traumatic, and it's revamped the entirety of the productive system of the southern states.
We also see at this time a country moving west, and how does that change the political situation in, say, in Washington, D.C.?
Well, one of the things we want to see, when we want to understand about this movement west, which of course is one of the great themes of American history, movement west, opportunity, transformation, democratization. Of course, for slaves, it's just the opposite. It means the destruction of their families. It means being uprooted. It means losing your children if you remain behind. But for people who are free, for free workers, it speaks to opportunity, democracy, all kinds of changes as well. So that system, if we say the system of slavery is changing, the system of freedom is also changing as well. And one of the big changes, of course, is the very understanding of freedom. In the early part of the 19th century, the understanding of freedom was that freedom rested upon control over property that could produce other property. Increasingly during the 19th century, people are they're losing their property, and they're forced to work for wages. And that's a new understanding of freedom, that if you work for wages, you can be a free person, as distinguished from a slave. Now, those differences and those changes, of course, are what's going to, in some sense, make the 1850s the very yeasty decade it is.
How much are some of those ideas of freedom homegrown, and how much of them perhaps borrowed from, say, some of the European thinkers?
Well, the United States is part of a larger Atlantic world in which many of these same changes are going on. That is, notions of freedom are being transformed. And in fact, what you asked about the westward movement. Part of the reason people are moving west is to try to maintain those older notions of freedom, to get access to land, to get access to a shop, to get access to a place where they can control their own destiny by controlling their own property. And those people believe that to work for wages is to be controlled by somebody else. And in some sense, that's driving people west. It's also driving people from Europe across the Atlantic to the New World, not simply to the United States, but other parts of the Americas, as people in Europe are also looking for ways to maintain that older notion of freedom. So we see the Atlantic as one piece.
You mentioned the Americas. What's happening in terms of blacks when we look at terms of comparative slavery? What's happening in terms of blacks in South America, the Caribbean? Because we've known that, we've had many of those islands already free in terms of the abolishment of slavery.
During the 19th century, beginning with emancipation in the northern states of the United States, a movement against slavery begins to sweep across the larger Atlantic world. First, beginning in very small way in the northern states where there aren't many slaves, but the president is established. Then erupting violently on the island of Saint Domingue, where slaves seize their own freedom and create the Black Republic of Haiti. Then, of course, the British emancipating their slaves and their colonies, and slavery falling all over the Atlantic world, so that if you're a person who believes in freedom, you see the wave of freedom cresting. If you're a person who's trying to control slaves, you're on the defensive. And slavery is very much on the defensive in the middle of the 19th century.
When we look at the Civil War in our country, is that the result of slavery?
Absolutely. There's no way to understand the Civil War without understanding the centrality of slavery. For a long time, we've been in denial about this. We've talked about its other matters. It's matters of states' rights. It's matters of tariffs or internal improvements or debates about taxation.
You reject all of that?
I don't reject all of that, but what I try to do is I try to show the connections, the ligaments, which connect the issue of slavery to notions of states' rights and national power. Nobody is for states' rights in their abstract. They're always for states' rights when it has to do
with something. Let's talk about something that we see today.
Okay.
We see across our country, in certain parts of our country, just enthusiasm in terms of keeping the Confederacy alive and, honoring it and things of that sort. And it seems that everybody wants to run around in little gray uniforms, but no one wants to talk about slavery. Do you feel that there's some sort of romantic way that we look at the South today?
Well, I think actually, Ethelbert, a lot of people want to talk about slavery. Sometimes it's in connection with, with the Confederacy, as with the struggle over the Confederate flag in South Carolina and Georgia and Mississippi and other places as well. But we've had in the theater, we've had movies like Glory and Amistad and Beloved. On TV, we've had any number of docudramas about slavery. We now have a museum to slavery in Cincinnati, Museum to Underground Railroad, $100 billion museum. We have discussions of creating a museum on the Mall here in Washington and other places as well. So I actually think there's a desire to engage slavery, and of course it manifests itself in our politics as well, on issues of apologies, issues about affirmative action, issues about reparations, Tom and Sally, and the paternity of Sally Hemings' children. So, I mean, slavery is an issue which in some ways is enjoying something of a renaissance, and it comes as one piece with trying to deal with the Civil War, trying to deal with the Confederacy, trying to deal with that experiences as well, which is these are difficult issues. These are difficult issues for the American people to deal with, difficult issues for us to deal with. But I think there's the kind of churning that's going on, the kind of interest both in popular culture and the politics, speaks to a real desire to address them.
Well, I think this is a good reason for us to look at the Emancipation, very closely. If we look at the Emancipation Proclamation, we have to look at it, I guess, almost as a war measure. It is an outgrowth of the Civil War. Lincoln makes some decisions based on what's happening in terms of how the war is going. Are there any battles that sort of encourage the Emancipation Proclamation in terms of things that occurred at a certain time that Lincoln looks at and says, well, we better do something?
Well, I think you can't understand the Emancipation Proclamation, without understanding the war itself, the policies of the Union government, the policies of the Confederate government, and of course the desires of those people who are ultimately most involved in the Emancipation Proclamation, the slaves themselves. I begin this understanding by saying, all right, at the beginning of the war, every federal policy maker from Lincoln on down of any significance said this was a war for Union. This was not a war about slavery. This was a white man's war. This was not a war in which black people were going to participate. Slaves, from the beginning, understood it differently. They understood it was about them, and they saw the division within the ruling class, the division within the United States, as an opportunity to seize their freedom, to gain their freedom, to transform themselves from slaves to free people, to make a change that would be momentous for themselves and their posterity. And we'll see this once the war begins, along a broad front of slaves presenting themselves at Union encampments, understanding that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. They'll present themselves in Union camps. They'll volunteer information. They'll volunteer to work, to clean camps, to cook, to provide information. And often, because of the nature of federal policy and the continued enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, these slaves will be returned to their owners, and often punished for running away. That's episode number one. What happens over time is that Union soldiers at the lowest level take a look at what's happening, and they see people volunteering their service to help them in one way or another. We're talking about soldiers who are not necessarily abolitionists, probably not abolitionists, not necessarily people who have any particular affection or love for black people. Most of them, of course, are racists. And hold black people in contempt. But they see these people in some ways trying to help them, and they see them being taken away and being punished. And moreover, not only that, these very same people who once offered to help them are being put to work in the Confederate cause against them. Right. And they say, does this make any sense? Right. This begins a dynamic which is going to begin to unroll Union policy and force people higher up, first within federal command and then, of course, within Lincoln's cabinet and Lincoln himself to change their mind about the war.
We're sitting here in your home and sort of put you on location.
Yeah.
We're not that far from Fort Stevens.
Right.
We're not that far from Fredericksburg. Bull Run. All these places are key Civil War battles. What is the mood of black people, whether free people of color in this city? What's happening here in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I think black people are worried. They're concerned. They're concerned for lots of reasons, but they also are extremely hopeful. Early on, of course, Washington becomes one of those centers people run away to. Washington, on the eve of the Civil War, has a very substantial free black population, which will shelter some of these runaways. It also has a kind of indigenous anti-slavery movement, which again provides a shelter. And moreover, we talked about runaway slaves working for the Union cause, for the Union Army, for the Union Navy. Washington is a giant military encampment, and the military, of course, needs soldiers, but needs many more laborers than it does soldiers.
But let's look at this very closely. You have Virginia,
right?
Robert E. Lee's Virginia, and that's very close here.
Right.
Then you have Maryland, which is at one time, I guess, Lincoln saw this as one of the border states.
Mm-hmm.
So, are you saying that between Virginia and Maryland, the blacks here in D.C. represented a different type of thinking?
Well, they represent an opportunity. And slaves run away to Washington. They find work. They find de facto freedom, first under the First Confiscation Act, which says that slaves of disloyal owners which are being used against the Union Army, can be appropriated as contraband, not as free, but as contraband, and put to work in the Union cause. And then the Second Confiscation Act, which says that any slave who enters Union lines will be protected.
Let me interrupt you there.
And we also, between the two Confiscation Acts, if I may, between the two Confiscation Acts, slaves were emancipated in the District of Columbia in March of 1862.
But I'm going to interrupt you.
Okay.
Because we know these confiscation acts just don't pop up out of nowhere.
Right.
Let's look at the U.S. Congress at this time and some of the radical members, people like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner. How do they shape some of these acts, and who are these people?
Well, these are people coming out of a radical anti-slavery movement. The political movement against slavery in the North has two great prongs. One is a radical anti-slavery movement, which is concerned for immediate emancipation, which is deeply concerned about equality and the creation of what they believe is an egalitarian republic, a racially egalitarian republic. Key figures in this movement are people like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and others. There's another prong to the anti-slavery movement, and those are generally called free soilers. They're against slavery, but they're not so much concerned about the question of race. They're against slavery because they see slavery subverting the republic, its ideals, but also because they believe that slaveholders have far too much power. They're concerned about how the slaveholders' power are affecting issues like tariffs and internal improvements and taxation and access to land and banking policy and a whole variety of other things. Of course, it's out of that free soil movement, that Republican Party movement, which will produce Abraham Lincoln. So politically, we're situating people like Stevens and Sumner at the left wing of the Republican Party. That is, Republicans who are political abolitionists, but also who have been deeply touched by radical abolitionism. and the desire to create a racially egalitarian
Well, what type
republic.
of pressure did they put on Lincoln?
Well, they try to put as much pressure as they can on Lincoln in that direction, and Lincoln resists that pressure. He resists that pressure because, as you mentioned, he needs the border states, that is, those slave states which are within the Union. We're talking about Maryland,
Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky.
Right.
Right.
Lincoln understands that he has enough votes to win the presidency by winning the northern states. He doesn't have enough votes to win the war. If he loses Maryland, if he loses Kentucky, if he loses Missouri, Lincoln says, quite frankly, we can't win this. We can't win this war. So he has to be extraordinarily attentive to slaveholders in those border states, and he is during the first 2 years of the war.
And he also has in the back of his head the whole idea of colonization too, right?
Lincoln is extremely pessimistic about the possibilities of black people and white people living together in this country in freedom.
So he was looking to Liberia, Central America.
He's looking. He's not exactly sure where he's looking.
Somewhere.
But that's right, somewhere, anywhere but here. Lincoln, great hero, Henry Clay, of course, is a colonizationist. Lincoln follows Clay on this belief that it's just not going to work. You're never going to be able to free the slaves, and if you free the slaves, you're certainly not going to have, given the nature of American society, given the nature of white prejudice, given the nature
well, how did free blacks, people like someone like a Frederick Douglass, how did they respond to these colonization ideas?
Colonization is a very complex movement, and it is a movement which at one time or another has support within the black community. Most, however,
still does.
and still does. In fact, the American Colonization Society, an organization formed which eventually establishes Liberia, formed in 1816, is still meeting well into the 20th century. It's an idea which Americans don't give up. White Americans don't give up easily. But for the most part, most black politicals and most black people, free blacks, are opposed to colonization. They say, as does James Forten early in the 19th century, says, "Here we were born. Here our fathers and mothers were born. We fought in the American Revolution. We helped build this country. This is our country. This is where we want to remain." And for the most part, they believe, black people believe, that colonization is a kind of slaveholder's trick to try to eliminate free blacks and in that way make slavery a more airtight system, a better slavery, because you've eliminated those people who have demonstrated and are in fact free. I think that's probably what most black people believe in the middle of the 19th century. Although, as we know, the opinion of black people, like the opinion of white people, is very, very diverse.
Talking about diverse ideas, let's go back to Lincoln and deal specifically with the Emancipation Proclamation now. When we look at it, we get three drafts. We get a July 22nd, 1862 draft, which is in the Library of Congress, September 22, 1862, another copy that's in the New York State Library, and then January 1st, 1863, which is in the National Archive. I write poetry. I put a lot of emphasis on revision. Lincoln revises this Emancipation Proclamation. Let's go back to the first draft. What do we see there?
What we're talking about here, that first draft that Lincoln is working on in the middle of the summer of 1862. It comes at a time when Lincoln no longer needs the border states as much as he did earlier in the war. in some ways, one way to understand emancipation is to understand a change of Lincoln's constituency. Early in the war, he needs the border states, and he needs border state slaveholders. As the Union Army has moved in deeper and deeper into the South, the border states are becoming less and less important less and less important. And in fact, what Lincoln will tell the border states in the middle of the summer, he's going to tell them, he says, slavery is being worn away by what he calls friction and abrasion. He says, the friction and abrasion of this war is going to destroy the institution of slavery. You guys wise up. You guys better get on this train because it's leaving the station. He's never able to get them on that train, but Lincoln's not going to stay behind at the station with these guys. So by the middle of 1862, his constituency is changing, whereby the border state slaveholders are less important, and the slaves, or former slaves, who are working for the Union Army are becoming more important. The enormous numbers of slaves, the Union Army can't exist without all those slaves who were doing a lot of the dirty work, of the war, and moreover the pressure from radical abolitionists in the North, for many Northerners against slavery, to punish the South, even if you don't feel that emancipation is the best policy, to punish the South for this war, which is chewing up our children, on our sons, is again putting pressure on Lincoln. Lincoln is beginning to make that decision. We see that decision where he's thinking about emancipation.
Well, let's look at that.
By the middle of the summer of 1862, he sees it coming.
Okay, let's look at 1862. Isn't Lincoln also looking at perhaps amending the Constitution and providing some sort of compensation to the Southerners?
Lincoln always hopes that the war, that there can be some kind of rapprochement. Emancipation took place in the northern states by compensating slaveholders and a process of gradual emancipation over time.
Let me ask you this.
When Frederick, go ahead.
I want to ask you, I guess it's an ethical question. The thing of compensation. Let's put aside the war, situation. Should people be compensated for property that is taken from them, and especially during a war?
From my perspective, certainly not. That is, in some ways, these people have been compensated. Slaveholders have been compensated, since the beginning of slavery, by getting the labor of slaves, and that labor, of course, has in many ways enriched them. It has elevated them in status within their society, and of course it has anointed them with enormous amounts of political power.
Is it fair to put a price tag on that, or is it possible to put a price tag on that?
I'm not exactly sure how that would be done. One could compute the value of slave property. There are roughly 4 million slaves in 1860. We can say they're roughly worth, if we took an average value of what slaves are selling for, probably about $750
now, let me ask you, did Lincoln do what you just did?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Right. He wasn't good at math.
Right.
I was just wondering about that because, you go back and you read about
Probably better in math than I am.
I just wondered whether it was thought through to that extent or whether it was just like, okay, we've got to do something to appease the South. As we talk about compensation, but we don't figure it out.
I think it's an attempt to end the war, an attempt to end the divisions within his own side, within the Union side, by compensating slaveholders in the border states. And Lincoln will talk about this almost right up until the time when he signs the final Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st. But we see Lincoln, to go back to your initial query, we see Lincoln in the middle of the summer of 1862 making that decision for emancipation, and he will bring that decision to his cabinet. There'll be a discussion of that, and then in the middle of September he'll issue what's called the preliminary.
Okay. Let me go
Emancipation
back a little
Proclamation.
and have you comment on another key figure
Right.
here. One of the first drafts that Lincoln comes up with, he shares with his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin. Okay. Whenever time I see that name, I sort of chuckle because you go to people like J. Rogers and people say, well, here was one of the vice presidents that was African American.
Right.
You always have that sort of J. Rogers analysis. But what's interesting is that
He was very dark in
he was very
color.
dark in color, and he had a name like Hannibal. You put that together. But he was also, when you look at the politics that you described earlier, he was one of those individuals, very outspoken in terms of emancipation. It seems as if Lincoln wanted to get his feelings first. I read where, I think this is John Hope Franklin's book, that Lincoln shares the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation with Hannibal Hamlin, and he doesn't say anything.
Right.
You know,
I think he corrects some comments in the draft.
okay.
Or something.
But I'm looking at that in terms of here are people who I wonder if, for example, if Hamlin had been very critical, would that have perhaps taken Lincoln aback and maybe he would have rethought it?
Well, when Lincoln does begin to present his ideas around, certainly at the September 22nd meeting of his cabinet, there are people who are critical of it. Lincoln's pretty much made up his mind by now what he's about to do.
There's two signatures. I'm gonna pull. Seward is on here. What's his position? Was he a strong advocate?
Seward's position was that the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation should, or even the preliminary proclamation, should follow a Union victory. That is, it shouldn't come out looking as a desperate measure. It should be issued from a position of strength. And in the discussions in the cabinet, that's Seward's position. He's in favor of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He doesn't have any problems with either the compensation or the discussion of colonization. However, he would prefer it to wait until there's a Union victory. And of course, Lincoln will do that. Lincoln will follow Seward on that, and he'll wait for what he takes to be a Union victory. That is the Battle of Antietam. It turns out, of course, it's not much of a victory. To the extent it's a victory, it's a very bloody and costly victory. But that's good enough for Lincoln. And then, of course, on September 22nd, he'll issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, giving warning to slaveholders this is coming.
Let me go through. I feel like a free person of color here holding my Emancipation Proclamation here. But I want to go through some specific things here and get your response. This begins by the President of the United States of America proclamation. In the beginning, whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing other things. What happens between September 22nd, 1862 and January 1st, 1863?
What happens is a continually deepening commitment on Lincoln's part to emancipation. I think a deepening commitment within the country itself. One of the threats that is made by those people who oppose the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is that Union soldiers will throw down their arms. They won't fight for this. I think there's a growing confidence that will not happen. There's also a continued recognition of the importance of black labor. And moreover, Lincoln's attempts during this period between September 22nd and January 1st, attempts to convert those border states, to get them to act, pleading with them, sometimes just pleading with them, to act. I'll pay you guys, for your slaves. Even places like Delaware, there are a tiny number of slaves in Delaware, and he can't get these guys just blow them off.
Right.
It becomes clear to Lincoln. What Lincoln says is that we can't fight this war with one hand tied behind our back.
Now he also says here in the second paragraph, these are the people who are rebelling against the United States. So basically, someone would say, does he have authority to free these slaves since they're not part of the Union anymore?
Lincoln never accepts that. His understanding is that these are these are Americans in rebellion, that he still has authority over the states.
But what about the status of blacks who are in the Union?
That, of course, Lincoln is concerned about. That's why he's trying to get the border states, Unionist slaveholders, to abolish slavery and accept compensated emancipation.
Now, there's also some places here that he sort of like went easy on. Like Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana. He had accept certain parishes. Why is that in there?
Those are places which are already under Union control. Those are places in which and Lincoln's belief, from the beginning of the war, is that the Civil War is a conspiracy of slaveholders. It's a small number of guys who've hijacked the South. That most Southerners, that there's a strong basis of Unionist Southerners. He's in many ways far too optimistic about the number of Southern Unionists. But that's one of Lincoln's beliefs right from the beginning of the war, is that if I can get these Unionists in the South, back them up, give them a little backbone, support them. In any cases, he's talking about here parts of Virginia, parts of Louisiana, where the Union Army is already in control, and where the process of bringing these parts of the South back into the Union is underway. He doesn't want to alienate those Unionist slaveholders, although the Second Confiscation Act has already declared that slaves who have come into Union lines are now to be protected.
Here's another statement, and this is almost the end of the document. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. When I saw that, I sort of chuckled. I said, this sounds like the Black Panther Party here about self-defense. But then also it's very interesting that Lincoln talks about labor faithfully for reasonable wages, because you get this movement from slavery into being a wage earner.
He's beginning to talk about the new system of wage labor, of free labor, which of course is beginning to take shape in those parts of the South which have already been captured by the Union. We're talking about those areas along the coast of South Carolina, the so-called Sea Islands, parts of Virginia, in Louisiana. The Union during this period is, we sometimes think that Reconstruction begins when the Civil War ends. Actually, Reconstruction begins when the Civil War begins. Mm-hmm. That is, the process of transforming a slave society to a free society. And exactly what freedom means, that's, a question which is going to, starts very, very small, but it's going to get larger and larger and larger over time. And here we see it growing.
And it also seems as if Lincoln is aware that looking at the society, some people would not be in favor of this and would probably commit violence against people of color.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. This transformation from slavery to freedom is an extraordinarily violent transformation. In fact, it's a violent transformation everywhere. Nowhere, really nowhere. You have to, to kind of scrape the bottom of the exceptional historical barrel. Look for places like Vermont where there are hardly any slaves.
What about women?
See emancipation which does not take place without violence.
How does the draft rights play out in terms of this later on? Because we see this in New York where people say, well, I'm not going to go to war and for black people and slavery and things of that sort.
New York is kind of the center of the anti-war movement, the center of Northern democracy, the Democratic Party, the opposition to the Democratic Party. And of course, a lot of that opposition is laced with racism.
And blacks were attacked during those riots.
And the opposition to the war, to the draft, at a time when the Union Army is just grinding it out, and thousands of people, 600,000 people die, 600,000 Union soldiers. So there's an enormous number of people who are, and this is extraordinarily frightening, and many people opposed to the war, seeing the war as a war now by 64 as a war for emancipation, and looking for the handiest target they can get their hands on, turn against black people in the North in a vicious race riot, which destroys a good part of the infrastructure of black life: churches, schools, orphanages, and of course...
Which was not shown in the movie The Gangs of New York.
No, this was not shown in the movie The Gangs of New York.
But you mentioned about the soldiers and how many people were involved in it, and near the end here of the proclamation, you see Lincoln making a reference to receiving these people into the armed services, and I think
that's the final Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, one of the things we talked, the question you asked about the difference between the preliminary and the final emancipation. Is, of course, in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, he talks about colonization. In the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, there's a discussion of compensation. Those disappear by January 1st. And in their place is a willingness to accept black men into the Union Army and Navy. And, of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation, there's the beginning of...
That seems major, because when you fast forward that to, like, say, World War I, where black people wanted to go and fight, democracy, it was this whole thing about whether we were human beings, the whole thing of equality in the service of a country. That was always seemed to be an issue. Here you see, back in 1863, the whole thing almost accepting the fact that people are human beings and can fight and can serve their country, even if it is a war measure.
Well, this whole question of, and I'm not exactly sure where this dynamic comes from, of shedding blood and manhood. If you shed blood,
what is that? Right.
But certainly from early in the war, right in the beginning of 1861, there are black volunteer units which are kind of drilling on their own. These little black militias and places, like Pittsburgh and Chicago, and volunteering their services. There's certainly a belief, as Frederick Douglass says, once we get those eagles on our lapels, equality is bound to follow. Not simply freedom, but equality as well. There's an enormous desire, both on the part of black people in the North, the free black community, and on the desire of abolitionists to use the entry of black men into the Union Army as a kind of crowbar, as a kind of lever to demand full rights for black people.
I thought that was captured very well in the movie Glory that had come out a number of years ago, where you saw the desire on the part of free blacks to also participate in the war effort.
Yeah, I think Glory does capture that, and of course the story of the 54th Massachusetts also captures the tragedy of that, of people being used as cannon fodder, the inequality within the service, the inability of people to become officers, the fact that they're paid, black soldiers are paid less at the beginning of the beginning of their entry. Right. So I think actually Glory is a really fine movie.
Color boys, go ahead and sign up. That's right. Tear it up. Tear it up. Tear it up. Tear it up.
I just want to ask you, actually maybe just two more questions. One is, looking at this document, and you're a teacher, how should it be taught in the classroom, today? How should this document be compared to, whether it's the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, how should we view it?
Well, there's a long tradition of kind of dissing the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, people point out that Lincoln, who had this extraordinary literary ability, writes a document which is, as you read it, is kind of like a bill of lading. There's a bill of particulars. There's none of the kind of grandiose rhetoric that might accompany. But I think, Lincoln understood that you didn't need grand rhetoric, that the Emancipation Proclamation stood on its own. I think also there's a dismissal of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's often said that it doesn't free a single slave more than was freed by
more proclamation than emancipation
by the existing legislation, by the Second Confiscation Act, which is true. But in some ways, of course, the Declaration of Independence doesn't make a single American colony independent of Great Britain until you win the war. The document has enormous importance, and that importance is certainly understood by Lincoln. It's understood by Jefferson Davis, who immediately, from the time the preliminary proclamation is issued, protests. It's certainly understood by the people who are most involved, that is the slaves and free blacks who celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation. So here's a very significant document. I would say you bring it into the classroom in much the same way as that you brought it, on this. That is, you read the document, you read the words, you try to understand what the words mean and why that particular formulation is presented, at that particular time. I'm a teacher who really does believe in, close reading of documents, and then the close interrogation of those documents to understand, precisely what they mean.
Which leads me into my last question.
Okay.
You've seen the documents
Right.
in which black people respond to the Emancipation Proclamation. Any surprises there in terms of when you look at the actual record, in terms of this document is issued, how do black people respond? You mentioned about celebration.
Well, I think yes. I think there's a kind of enormous wave of celebration that goes through the black community. There's an understanding that that there's no going back now. That the commitment has been made, and in fact, this turns out to be true. During 1864, when it looks like Lincoln's going to lose his re-election campaign, and there's a lot of talk of compromise and making a deal with the Confederacy. Lincoln says, "I'll be damned in hell if I ever take back the Emancipation Proclamation." I mean, it transforms him, and I think there's an appreciation of a kind of ratcheting up of commitment, and probably the most important of that ratcheting up of commitment comes with the recruitment of black soldiers. 200,000 black men will serve in the Union Army. They are critical to the Union's victory.
And we also see in 1865 the passing of the 13th Amendment.
Passage of the 13th Amendment, right? Which Lincoln understands this is a kind of war measure. He wants to put emancipation in a position where it can't be challenged, and the 13th Amendment does that.
came here as a young PhD student with my advisor, Ira Berlin, because he had a project, the Freedom Southern Society project. And I thought I was preparing myself to become a history professor in the academy, but since I'm a student of history and I have a passion for this stuff and working with historical records, I realized that I was in the guts of the nation's history, and particularly African American history from the federal perspective. So I decided to stay here and cast my career with the National Archives. But I'm also an adjunct. I teach one class at Howard University. So I sort of enjoy the best of two worlds. I really believe the document reveals the significance of the American Civil War. I believe that the American Civil War was the greatest social event in the history of this country. And the reason why I say that is because the Confederacy was truly a threat to the dissolution of the Union and the breaking of the Constitution. And the underlying cause of that was slavery. This country was split down the middle, free labor and slave labor. And there were also moral, religious, and spiritual resistance to the institution. It was an inhumane institution. And there were many in the country who felt that it was an economically backwards institution. And by the 1850s and 60s, it had become an eyesore for the United States. When the war finally comes, very few understood the dynamic that slavery would have on the war, because no one considered the interaction of slaves with the war, the Union Army, the Confederate Army. And once those slaves began to move towards the federal government and the Union Army, it really changed the whole dynamic of the war. The document signaled the entrance of a new freedom, a new nation, a new government to a large extent, because Reconstruction brought about constitutional changes that protected the rights of over 4 million new people to the nation, coming out of a system, slavery, that had denied them rights for over 200 years. There's been some physical damage done to this copy, but we've sort of cleared that up, and the preservation efforts have worked well. It's well protected here in the archives because we keep it in a temperature control, humidity control, cool, with very little light in a vault. And we bring it out, like I said, once a year now. It's exposed to light for a short period of time. All of the critical documents, important documents too, such as the Charter of Freedom. This is a document that the conservators keep an eye on. Here again, the idea is we want to preserve these documents for the next generations of Americans, the next 100, 150, 200 years, however long the country's going to be here.
Beautiful, for heroes proved in liberating strife. Who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, make success.
The Humanities Council of Washington, D.C. is proud to present Freedoms, Rights, and Responsibilities, a series of programs supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities We the People initiative, dedicated to exploring significant themes and events in U.S. history and sharing the lessons with all Americans.